Hello everyone, welcome to Reflections, a program sponsored by the Paducah Cooperative Ministry. Paducah Cooperative Ministry is a cooperative effort of area congregations joining together to respond to basic human needs and conditions in McCracken County, and we've been at it since 1973. My name is Heidi Sir Heinrich, and I am your host for this program today, as well as the Executive Director of the Paducah Cooperative Ministry. And our guests today are two experts in the area of homelessness. Candace Malloy is our homeless and housing case manager at Paducah Cooperative Ministry. Welcome, Candace.
Thank you.
And we also have Sheila Forrest, and Sheila is the homeless shelter director for the Paducah Cooperative Ministry. And these two women work daily with the complex issues of homelessness, which is the focus of today's program. So I'm so glad that you're here today. Thank you, and thank you all for joining us. Let's begin today by what would you like folks to know who may not be aware of or simply do not see homelessness in our area? Is it a big problem, Candace, in Western Kentucky, homelessness?
It is. I think a lot of people don't see homeless people, so therefore they assume we don't have any.
Okay.
But it is definitely an issue. We actually, at our shelter at PCM, we generally help about 300 people a year with shelter. So that in and of itself shows you that there are people that are homeless. Okay,
well, why are they invisible? Why don't people see them? Why is it a surprise to people?
Mostly because a lot of times in Paducah, homeless that we see are actually maybe staying with a family member or friend, and can't continue staying there. Or there's several homeless families living in one unit, maybe 3 or 4 families pulling their money together, and so therefore, you know, if they weren't for those other families, then they wouldn't have a place to stay. So that's what homelessness looks like here. In other cities, it a lot of times is a little more visible, seeing people sleeping on the streets and stuff.
Okay, all right. Well, what does a typical homeless person look like in our area? Sheila?
Me, you, Candace.
Okay.
They look like everybody else. It's not the stereotypical person with a grocery cart or a bunch of bags. Oftentimes people in our shelter also come from other areas, and they come into town with nowhere to stay. They may be fleeing domestic violence, or things just aren't working out at home, can't find work, so they come to our area and they've heard of our shelter. So they look like everybody else. There is no look for a homeless person.
Okay. So pretty much anybody could become homeless, is that right?
A lot of people are a paycheck away from being homeless, yes, definitely.
Okay, all right. That's a little bit scary, isn't it?
It is.
Okay. So there is a difference, you would say, between rural areas. You know, when you go to places like Chicago, St. Louis, homeless people are very, very visible, aren't they? They're in the doorways, they're on the benches. What do we see? What is the face of homelessness here in Western Kentucky? What are we seeing?
Well, we're seeing more families, you know, young parents with children that, you know, as soon as they turn 18, they have to leave their parents' home, or they're living with a boyfriend or, you know, a girlfriend, and they have to leave home because it's not working out. So we see a lot of young parents with children.
A lot of young people. Okay, I think that's a surprise to people. Sheila, you've been at this for a little while, haven't you? You've been
1997.
Since 1997. Have you seen any changes in the face of homelessness? What you were seeing in 1997 and what you saw in 2012, how did they compare?
Well, for one thing, in the beginning when I first started working at PCM, we housed men, single men, so that makes a difference. But consistently, the age has gotten younger of who we house. When I first started, I'd say the median age was probably late 20s, early 30s, and now as soon as they turn 18 and are eligible for our shelter, we're getting them in our shelter. There's a lot more young people that are coming to the shelter, and you know, we get requests for them younger than that. We just can't house them. So the biggest difference, I think, is the age. They're just so much younger.
What are some of the reasons, guys, why they're younger and younger? Is there a breakdown in the families that we can point to? Is it a lack of education that's taking place in our school systems? Values? What do you think is causing so much homelessness, particularly with young families and children? Is it economic? What do you see? And tell us about a typical family that comes in and the story that they have to tell you?
Me?
Sheila? Yeah.
I was going to say, which one of us? Like I said, oftentimes it's young mothers who have been living with their parents, and maybe their parents aren't really parenting themselves. They've got some issues of their own, whether there's physical or mental or substance abuse issues. So these younger parents are trying to learn to take care of themselves. So the first thing they feel like they need to do is leave home in order to do that. And honestly, it's hard to parent your children if you're living with your parent. So oftentimes they'll leave because they don't want to be the child, because they've got to be a parent.
Okay.
So I think that has a lot to do with it. So typically, you know, we're seeing 20, 21-year-old mothers that are coming to the shelter with 2, 3, 4, 5 children and having to take care of them and don't have a clue. You know,
Okay.
so it's
Don't know how to put the resources together to become self-sufficient?
No, no.
I think in addition to that, I think a lot of times the younger generation hasn't been taught the things like how to take care of your house and how to manage money and how to be a good parent. And so
Right.
whenever, whether it's like Sheila said, they are kicked out of their parents' house because they've turned 18 and it's time to move on, or they just decide that they're an adult now and they want to take care of themselves and their family, they don't really know how.
Okay.
You know, just last year, our adult population, 30% of them did not have a high school education.
That's
I think
pretty big. That's
it
pretty
is.
big.
And I think the youngest was 7th grade. One of the ladies only had a 7th grade education.
Wow.
And, you know, that makes it difficult. If you've only went as far as 7th grade, then you don't know a lot of the life skills that you need.
And probably
to take care of
weren't doing
yourself.
very well in 7th grade. And I think
Probably.
that's a surprise. It is to me to realize in this day and age we still have folks that aren't getting the type of education they really need to be able to be self-sufficient adults. I think that's terribly sad. What do we need to do in society to change this? What are some of the changes you guys would like to see in society? I know PCM is just a small, tiny little dot in this whole issue, but what needs to happen to change things?
I think there's a lot of things that probably would need to happen.
Where would you start?
Probably housing and employment.
All right, let's talk about housing and employment.
Okay.
What needs to happen there?
A lot of times, again, going back to the younger folks, if they haven't worked in the past, then getting a job is difficult. If they don't have an education that brings them past high school, then that's difficult to do. A lot of our folks are only working minimum wage jobs, you know, fast food restaurants,
Okay.
grocery stores, department stores, and it takes about a third of your income to live as far as housing goes. So whenever you talk about rent and utilities and all that kind of stuff, the average person is going to need to work 70 hours a week on minimum wage in order to meet the fair market rent in Paducah. For instance, for a 2-bedroom, the fair market rent is $559.
Okay.
And one person working minimum wage at about 30 to 40 hours a week only brings home about $600 to $700. So that's their whole paycheck just to pay rent.
Okay, and are folks able to find full-time work?
I don't think it's as easy as we used to think it was. You know, whenever I was working at 16, it was easy to work full-time hours. I mean, everybody needed you to. Nowadays, a lot of people seem full-time is 30 hours maybe.
Right.
Part-time's 15. So it's difficult to make it on that income.
So if you needed to work 70 hours a week to afford an apartment in a fair market area, that'd be 3 part-time jobs, right? Okay. What other barriers are there to achieving self-sufficiency? Transportation,
Transportation, child care, the transportation, the buses, we have a city bus system, but they stop running at 5 o'clock.
They stop running at 5 o'clock.
And they
Not
don't
everybody
start,
gets off work at 5 o'clock,
and
is
they
that
don't
right?
start until 8, so, you know,
Okay.
and they don't run on Sunday.
Okay.
And they don't start on Saturday until 9. So that limits where a person could work, and so many people are quick to say, well, I can only work around the bus schedule, and when they tell an employer that
Right.
they're talking to that that's how they can work, the first thing the employer does is just kind of go past that application and go to the next one, because there are those that are willing to walk to work or ride a bicycle to work. We had a gentleman in our shelter that had one arm and rode a bicycle to the Walmart by the mall because he had to get to work.
From the south side where PCM
From the south
is
side
located.
to the mall, Walmart.
All the way to the mall, one-arm bicycle. That sounds dangerous.
But that's what he did. I know a young lady that was in our shelter who now has an apartment in housing in Elmwood, and she walks oftentimes to the mall, Walmart, to get back and forth to work because she doesn't have a car, she doesn't have rides all the time. So to make sure she gets there, that's how she gets to work.
Right.
But oftentimes when our folks are homeless, that's not going to be their motivator. They're not going to be willing to do that much more in order to keep a job. Instead, they'll just say, I can't.
I can't. Okay, so housing is one concern, adequate and affordable housing for folks, and then transportation. You know, it sounds to me like most folks getting their start are going to be working, retail, restaurants, fast foods, as you mentioned, and typically not full-time work. I'm guessing they're going to have some nighttime hours, and I'm guessing they're going to have some weekend hours, and all it takes is 1 or 2 times of not being able to get to work to lose that job. That sounds like a real risky situation.
Which then in turn means they're going to lose their housing if they don't have their job. So yes, it's very risky. Okay,
and you mentioned child care as well as being one of the barriers to success.
Yes.
Okay. I'm guessing if your child gets sick with the flu, as going around quite a bit right now, then you can't take them to daycare, right?
They'll call you to even come get them if they become too ill. They'll call a parent
and
tell them to come get them, and the school will call.
Okay.
And I don't think they can go back if they have a fever either.
No,
so
they have to stay home until it's gone.
So that usually means the parent, and in most cases I think we're talking about single-parent families. That means the parent is most likely going to miss work to stay home with the child unless there's another supportive family member or a friend that can help and step in.
And if they're new to this area, then they don't have that. It's just themselves. So once they can't go to work because the child is ill, they just can't go to work.
Yeah, and with that, with other family members, another thing that we see a lot of is generational poverty. So if you have, say, your mother is in the same situation you are, barely can pay her own rent and barely can keep her job, then she's not going to be able to watch your child if they're sick because she can't miss work either.
Right.
So even if they do have family and friends that are good support systems, they may not have that ability to help out in that way. So, you can't ask somebody to put themselves in jeopardy whenever, or just to help you out. So
right. It's a tough situation.
Very.
So success rates are on the low side, would you say?
Well,
or
we
what
measure
would you
those
say?
probably a little differently.
Okay, tell me about that.
Our main goal at PCM, of course, is to help them get into safe, affordable housing, and oftentimes we're able to do that if we can get them to stay still and kind of mellow out. So that we consider that first and foremost to be successful if they can get into housing.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think Sheila made a good point. What we consider success is not necessarily what they consider success. And every single person that comes through is completely different. Sometimes getting to the shelter and actually stabilizing for a few months, that's success in their eyes. Sometimes our shelter is the first place they've came to that's actually what they would consider home and safe and warm and
best place they've been in a while.
Yeah. And
that's a good point. That's a good point. We have some preconceived notions, don't we, on what success should look like and what a person should have to be successful. And you're right, that may not be somebody else's. I mean, we may be starting up here and not realizing that they're starting down here, and to get halfway there is huge. And sometimes I think that the PCM shelter is almost like a safe harbor to folks who maybe have had such a tumultuous life with a lot of trauma and things that we can't really even imagine, and to come into a shelter situation where things are quiet, safe, routine, that may be. I remember one person in particular that we knew that was the best place she had ever been, which I think is very hard for other people who have never experienced homelessness or imagined what that would feel like to really understand and picture.
One of the children in one of our families that came not too long ago, the first thing that she said was, I get to sleep in a bed by myself. And I said, yeah. So yeah, it's it's different for them than it is for us.
Well, certainly, and you talked about the families doubling up, you know, that become in a homeless situation, you may have 2 or 3 households under one roof. Well, you can imagine it may only be a 2 or 3 bedroom, 1 or 2 bedroom house, and so you've got a lot of folks on the floor and in little corners with a blanket, and I don't think that we really stop to consider all of the issues that come to light in a homeless situation. So, ladies, how do you keep from getting discouraged? What drives you to keep at this work, to keep striving? What is it about this work that challenges you and appeals to you?
You can go first.
Well, one thing that really helps me continue going, honestly, is our staff. PCM has a wonderful staff. All of us have a good sense of humor, and we laugh at ourselves and our situations sometimes. And if it wasn't for that, it would make it more difficult. But then also, I feel like God really called me to be here.
Okay.
And so when I am frustrated and very irritated, then I just remember that this was not, this is God's plan. So I'm where I'm supposed to be, and that kind of gives me that energy to keep going. Plus, the success stories really help. You know, there may only be one every once in a while that we consider the ultimate success of, moving out and being self-sufficient, and us not seeing them again.
By middle class standards, I guess. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
That really does help too. It's the small ones that, that can help you keep going. So.
Right. Well, Candace, how did you come to this calling? How did you wind up at PCM?
Well, it's kind of a few things in the making. I was at Murray State University in 2002, is whenever I started there. 2003, I went on spring break mission trip, went to New Orleans, and worked with my very first homeless person. The very first guy that I ever met that was homeless was a former doctor.
A former doctor?
He had made a mistake that I think many doctors probably have done in the past. He wrote a prescription for a narcotic for somebody, and that didn't need it, and they found out about it. He lost his license. Of course, his family was very upset at him. Lost his family, his wife, his children, and then before he knew it, he had nowhere to go, nobody who really cared about him. And so I was sitting across the table from this man who, as Sheila said before, didn't look homeless. I would have never pictured him walking down the street going, oh, that's a homeless person. And he was telling me this story, and my heart just broke for him. I mean, he said that was the first time he'd ever done that. And, if that's the case, then the fact that he lost everything for one mistake, it really made me think, homelessness isn't what you see on TV or what a lot of people think. It's not necessarily the man who's always drunk and can't keep a job and everything. Sometimes it's just somebody who made a small mistake or even a big mistake that cost them everything.
Right, right.
So from there, I kind of felt my heart kind of growing for homeless, but at Murray, I had no clue that PCM existed or that there were homeless people in our area.
Right.
And so the next year, spring of 2004, I went to Philadelphia and worked with City Teamers Rescue Mission. They also are a homeless shelter in addition to several other things. Worked with more homeless people there, and that time I realized that I wanted to change my major. I was doing child education at the time. I wanted to change my major. Didn't really know what exactly I was going to do, but I wanted to work with a nonprofit. So then I graduated. I had considered going to Peace Corps and had actually went through the application process, had been given a site in Africa, and then found out in May, I think, of 2006 that I was not going to be able to go because of medical reasons. And that same week that I found that out, I saw an ad in the paper for an AmeriCorps position at Paducah Cooperative Ministry.
AmeriCorps is the national version of Peace Corps, is that right?
Yeah, this particular position was through the Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky, which is in Frankfort.
Right.
At that time, the program was called Getting Things Done for Kentucky's Homeless. It focused just on housing issues and taking somebody who's homeless and giving them a place to stay. And I read it and I was like, oh, that sounds wonderful. So I called Heidi and I, put in the application and everything, and I became an AmeriCorps member at PCM. I served 2 years through AmeriCorps, and then after my second year, PCM hired me. So
PCM said, boy, she's good, and she's learned, she knows everything we know, so we need to hang on to her.
Yeah, and with that being said, AmeriCorps is a wonderful program for that reason. When I graduated, I had a minor in youth and nonprofit leadership, but I had no experience really. I mean, I did an internship, I did a few mission trips, but I started through AmeriCorps, and I mean, probably in the first 3 months, I learned more than I had learned 4 years in college.
It's a great training ground, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I mean, I loved it. I got to, through PCM, I got to meet others in the community and everything. And if it wasn't for AmeriCorps, I'd never even heard of PCM. And I've lived in Paducah my whole life.
That's great. Now, you've been with us how long?
September will be 7 years.
Okay.
So.
Now, Sheila, you came through AmeriCorps as well, and tell us a little bit about your calling. It's a really interesting story. Tell us about that.
Yeah, mine came about in a different way from Candace's. While I did do AmeriCorps, I was already at PCM when I started AmeriCorps. I started with PCM, I'd say, because of my mother. Okay. My mother worked as the shelter manager for about 2 years, and so I had gotten to see what PCM was about by going to visit her and being at her house and seeing the residents knock on her door. And I could remember saying, wow, that's a lot of work, Whew. My hat's off to you. And then the first person that was working with my mom quit, and my mom said, well, why don't you apply for the job? And I went, no, don't want to do that. No, thank you. Second time it happened and the person quit, was getting ready to quit. Mom said, well, why don't you apply? And I said, no, I'm good, thank you. But then my mom became ill with bronchitis and was still working. It was probably a February and it was cold out, and she was having to run around in the cold, and the person that was working with her wasn't helping. So I said, okay, fine, I'll come work with you. I worked with my mom for about 3 years out there, and then she quit. But I found that I had found my calling. It fits me perfectly. I've always been a people person. I don't take offense easily, and I have a very warped sense of humor, so I can deal with just about anything and not let it bother me. I found that I got along well with the residents, that I was able to help a lot of people, but I also found out that I discovered seriously what God does for one. While I was turning down the job, God knew I needed to be in the job for my mother, because my mother became ill with lung cancer. And there was no other place I could have worked that would have allowed me the luxury of being able to take care of my mother until she took her last breath, other than my job. So while the job itself is wonderful, and I know He put me there because I do a good job at the job, He also knew I needed to be there to take care of my mother. So I have no problem with my job. I've been there 16 years in April.
So are you ever bored?
No, and when it's quiet, I love it. But no, bored is not a word that comes to mind. No.
And have you seen it all, done it all?
No, and I don't want to. I've seen a lot. I've heard a lot. I've heard some stories that would just, tear your heart apart. I've seen children. We've had children in our shelter that have died while they were in our shelter, killed in car accidents, but I feel like I got to know those kids and gave them, somebody that gave them hope and gave them love while they were there. And I think it makes a big difference. I've had kids that were in our shelter that have come back to thank me after they became adults, or I run into them somewhere and they'll say, I remember you run the shelter, right? And I go, yes. And they say, you were so nice, you're so nice. I've watched little people that have come into the shelter that don't talk much, but over the time that they're there, they have started to talk and to say my name. They may mangle it, but they say my name, and it just, it just means so much to me. So I know that this was my calling. This is where I'm supposed to be.
I love hearing that, and I love hearing the faith. You are both women of faith, and it's clear that that helps propel you forward, has gotten you to this place, and is evident in the work that you do every single day and the impact that you have. Of course, PCM represents and reflects every manner of denomination that's found in McCracken County. So while we don't have a particular theology or anything like that, I think what we really try and do is express God's love through the work that we do. You know, we call it doing God's work with human hands, but the words that we use and everything that we do, we want to be as reflective of God as we can possibly do, to be that conduit. And building relationships is so important, isn't it?
Definitely.
Building relationships, and I think education. I know that when you speak about the younger and younger residents, we realize that it's not simply enough to say, here's an apartment for you. They've got to have the skills to be able to maintain it. They've got to have the money management, the income, the support systems, and so there's a lot of work to be done, one family or one individual at a time. You guys do great work, and I love working with both of you. You inspire me every day, and I know that today we have just barely scratched the surface of the things that we could talk about with regards to homelessness and Paducah Cooperative Ministries' response to that in specific. But we tried to give a good general overview today, and we're actually going to come back and do a second part and get into a little bit more of the specifics of the PCM program. If somebody wanted to find us, how would they find us, Candace? How's the best way to find us?
Well, we actually have a Facebook page.
Okay.
It's just Paducah Cooperative Ministry.
All right.
So you can definitely look us up there. We actually post things like news and needs and that kind of stuff. And then also, of course, they can come visit us in the office.
And we are located where?
402 Legion Drive,
Okay.
which is on the south side, behind the Mike Smith car lot, and our shelter is right behind that. So they come to the office first.
Right, come to the office first. Thank you very, very much. And thank all of you for being with us today. And we look forward to speaking with you again and scratching the surface a little bit deeper in terms of homelessness and how we can respond to that and what's going on in our world and how we can help make it better for folks, one person at a time. And thank you for being with us. This is Reflections. I'm Heidi Sir Heinrich, your host, and we look forward to being with you again. Be well and be at peace.